Welcome to Social UX POV. This video will focus on a new category that I am creating called UX leadership. Now, the reason for this is that I have been reading a lot about UX and information architecture over the last 5 years. However, I attended last spring in Vancouver, Canada, the Information Architecture Summit. And so that exposed me to a lot of leaders, thought leaders, who were presenting their ideas on UX and information architecture. So I think that this warrants a category to itself, because often these are things that are being thought about, not necessarily done, but within the realm of ideas, they warrant attention. So having been exposed to some of the top thinkers at the Information Architecture Summit in Vancouver, and since ideas have always appealed to me, as being an artist, I was always an early adopter, or I was an early adopter of technology. And I'm always interested in learning more about what leaders, visionaries, and others in their fields are thinking. So today what I want to do, that being said, is reference a blog, which does represent UX leadership with respect to the fact that it is about the evolution of UX design methodology. So it is a blog written by Ian Armstrong, who is the principal designer at Dell EMC Studio in San Francisco. And what I'd like to do is start with Ian's definition of a UX designer. He looks at the different visual models that have been presented over time. And what I'm going to do after this introduction is actually present them in a Prezi and examine them. And I will post actually this blog that I'm referencing below in the description for you to reference as well. So this particular blog, specifically called the evolution, let me see exactly here, the evolution of UX process methodology. I'm going to start again with a quote from Ian in which he defines the UX designer. So he basically says a UX designer is a leader, a process evangelist, a generator of insight, a purveyor of context, and a creative ideation machine. So 5 things: leader, process evangelist, generator of insight, purveyor of content, and creative ideation machine. I'm not sure about a machine. I'm a human. But nevertheless, let's unpack that for a second, shall we? As you know, I did get my certification as a UX designer from McKendy, although I do call myself an information architect, and that is the area of the architecture that appeals to me the most. But let's see if I'm qualified under that definition. So UX designer is a leader. Yes, I'm a leader. I would say I'm a thought leader. And that's basically what this channel is all about, examining everything through my point of view, with me as the figure, using the lens of UX, with the ground being social. So check that one. Am I a process evangelist? Well, behind me, right beside me here, is the UX thinking process, or the experience thinking process of McKendy. So yeah, that's all about a process. And I advocate that process. It's actually a big picture, what I would call systems thinking approach to the UX cycle of product and services. And when I took my training, we never actually drilled down into this methodology of the development process. That's just one aspect of the entire process. I think it goes in the blue section here. Yeah, where you actually do the development, design, and then deploying the development. But anyhow, I was aware of Agile from working in a startup community. but it wasn't central to my idea of the UX process. So in the Prezi, I'm going to show these UX models, process models that Ian references, as well as the Akendi one, and compare them because they are a top Canadian UX firm. So I think they warrant some attention, and that's the way that I have been taught, trained about methodology. So the next one is, am I a generator of insight? Basically for that, I'm going to ask, how would you not be if you did good research and spent time reflecting on the information you have gathered? You should be able to generate some insights from that. Again, for me, the big picture approach of UX and then analyzing the models that Ian presents, I actually looked at those models a long time ago, or when I was doing my research on UX. I actually, in my opinion, saw or thought that the social aspect was missing, and so I actually altered that model that Ian references, specifically the one of the multiple layers, the 4 or 5 layers that was created by Jesse James Garrett, which most UX people are familiar with. So yeah, I spent a lot of time looking at that model and playing around with it and changing it. That was the premise of my own startup, Enriched by Code, with social UX and data design being the focus, but the social UX being important, and that's how I've evolved into the social UX POV channel. So I put a check beside that. And then, am I a purveyor of content? Well, that's why I call myself an information architect, because knowledge can and must be organized to create value, and Ian references that. But, to take it a step further, it was written by Napoleon Hill in his Think and Grow Rich, which I reference in one of my initial blogs after I became a UX designer, that that information itself does not create wealth. It's the organization of information. So that's, where I saw the information architecture of a website, be it a transactional website or some other sort of organizational experience. It could actually become transformational. That one is at the top of my list these days. And so, and there are some thought leaders that are indicating that that's where UX is headed with respect to the impact that it's going to have on business when issues of ethics and social are continually made part of the scope of a project from the very start. So am I next point, number 5, am I a creative ideation machine? Well, I don't think I'm a machine, I'm a human being, but I love ideas. I generate a lot of ideas, and so I think this channel speaks for itself. And if you like it, please subscribe and like this video, and if you like the ideas I'm putting forth, tell your friends and share. So then Ian goes on to say, and I quote, UX design, as I've said elsewhere, doesn't really have any deliverables other than value. So that brings up something that's been in my mind the last week or so. I read a blog about transactional versus transformative experiences in business specifically. And so I feel strongly that information architecture has the power to create transformational experiences that have, been lacking in UX design, because for the most part it's been focused on transactions. So that to get the most out of UX, it is said, Jared Spool said actually, that we need to, have conversations, speaking the language of business and looking at business models. But this blog that I read over the last week or so, it actually was coming from a business perspective, and they were saying that if you want to take your business to the level of 10 times or 100 times its value, then you need to shift from transactions to transformational experiences or interactions. So that's coming from a business perspective. And I feel that we need to take the conversation to the next level and talk about how information architecture and user experience can create transformational experiences, which will be and are more closely tied to art and philosophy and culture and ethics, which is the second of my videos that I'm going to shoot today, which will be posted on my channel shortly. It will be a review of the World Information Architecture Day 2018 that took place a few weeks back. Again, from my own point of view, which was all online and remote. I was not at any of the physical locations, but rather it was a virtual presence. I had a virtual presence for 24 hours starting in Japan and then going through Europe and North America and ending up in South America. So please check that video out as well. So back to the evolution of UX process methodology. It's not a mythology, it's a methodology blog, in which Ian he starts with Donald Norman, who he says created the idea of the UX designer, and he references a video in which Norman speaks, and I actually watched that video, and my takeaway was that, quote, Norman says, UX is everything. It's the way you experience everything. It's the way you experience your life. It's a system. It's everything. Notice he repeated everything 1, 2, 3 times. It's everything, which I said, I think, in one of my earlier videos. UX, everything is UX. Everything is a user experience. From my perspective, POV, and others have their own POVs. We're all experiencing this reality. So then Ian says, he says, I can't, quote, he says, quote, I can't think of a better place to start unraveling the weird and confusing world of modern UX design than this. He says that his takeaway from that video is not even the originator of our field, which is Norman Nielsen, knows what to call himself anymore. He says these days he's a people designer. Well, for me, that says he's a social designer. People are social. And we all know what happens to those who are antisocial or perceived to be less than humans. These people are found outside the networks of power and the transactions and the economy, be they local or online. They're excluded. I mean, the history of indigenous peoples in North America and Africans in South Africa are examples of such exclusions and of a system designed to do so, a system called apartheid. So now let's take a look at the evolution of UX. UX process methodologies. In Ian's blog, he mentions 3, and he shows 3, and he itemizes the process. So I suggest you take a look at his blog if you want to see the details of each one, but we're just going to look at the visual models. So this is the first one for waterfall. The original UX method model, which apparently took way too long to execute. The next one is by Jesse James Garrett, and I see this as being a figure with 5 layers. This figure starts with the user needs, moves up through functional specs, information architecture, interface design, up to visual design at the very top. And then we move on to a series of shifts, design thinking, and then into agile, and finally into lean UX. Now, with the lean UX, I will point out that he does mention that in his blog, I'll just zero in on that part. This was very problematic with respect to the actual UX designers. What happened with this was that businesses started to think that UX was UX designers were basically given a title called UX UI designers. So what happened was they became they became central at the heart of the storm that Apple proved that design-led business could become the most valuable brand in the world. But as a result, there is a bias towards digital and graphic design, which has badly skewed business world's perception of what an experienced designer does. So to this day, far too many businesses still think of UX as a visual discipline. So that was and remains very problematic. There's a lot of discussion and discourse around that. So that was the outcome of the agile, because UX apparently became a block in this free-flowing model. And so only the visual is touched on. Now, this is the experience thinking process that I was trained, the methodology that I was trained under by Kendi. As you can see, if you start looking at the different parts of it, it actually does map to Garrett's layers, or figurative layers. But it does have an additional piece. So these are the ones that map, though. We're looking at the design and the construction, information, interaction, visual, and then into the development aspects. I did a sketch myself here. I see that form as a snake, which wraps around the core, which is user research and testing. But you'll notice on the outside here, we have the strategy piece. So the methodologies that are mentioned in the blog, they really focus on the design and the production, which raises the question again that Joel Spool mentioned about, are we speaking the language of business when we talk to clients with respect to their products? And if not, why not? And how do we learn that language? Well, let's talk about strategy. This is another model from Kendi called the total user experience life cycle, where the business organization is in the middle. And then around the inside here are all the different experiences of the product and or the service that happen, from the awareness, the exploration, the comparing, the actual transaction and purchase, out of the box experience, the setup, maintenance, update, recycling, and so on. Around that is inside here we have the branding, and then we have the client experience relating to, the UX team. We have the customer experience, and of course the outer ring is the user experience. So when I did this, I was thinking, well, what happened to the social? Where's the social experience with respect to, something called social media and that audience, and how it interfaces now and interacts with APIs and shifts the conversation about the development of a product and or after the usage of the product, not just the purchase, but the actual usage, where actually UX branding should be focused, is on the usage. So I started thinking about the social aspect, and when I looked back at Garrett's model, his figure model with the 5 layers, I started thinking, where does the social piece fit in? Do I add another layer? Do I create the shape around the outside with, sort of a hexagonal shape with the 6 sides, including the strategy, the scope, the structure, the skeleton, the skin, and then social? But the more I thought about it, it was like, to me, this figure remains, but social becomes the ground for the figure. So I'm returning again to the business conversation, which is missing, I think, in this blog, about the methodology. Where's the strategy? How do we arrive at a strategy? How does the business work with UX to have a strategy? So from the Kendi model, again, you see the visioning, the business requirements, the customer requirements are all taken into consideration from the start. The stakeholder conversation, and basically the user research equals the user needs, if we look back again at the model of the 5 layers of that figure. And if you map it to the Kendi, the UX research equals the strategy, because that is in the first phases, and then we have all the other ones on top. But typically, again, with this UI UX thing that has happened because of the agile and the sprint, the rush to production, we have a different outcome. We've changed the definition of what a UX designer is. It's interesting to note at this point that this is where I deviate with Ian, because he continues to look in that blog, and you should take a look at that blog. He continues to look at the different methods and goes into the Google Design Sprint and the dual process. I go up to the bigger picture, the big picture that was presented to me by Kendi, and then this one here again, where we look at the different aspects of business, branding, marketing, customer service, all falling under the UX umbrella, and enabling these conversations and these experiences around trust and loyalty and personal, which again I would think could be called social. All of these very important conversations, business and the business language. So yeah, my social UX point of view, this is how I arrived at it. It came through a lot of thinking about those methodologies, particularly the last two. I was never in the waterfall mode at all, but I am familiar with Agile from working in, like I said, in the UX or in the startup space. So that is where I'm at. Thank you for your time.